Workshop. We looked at who's in, who's out, and who's in between. We talked about how schools tend to be replicas of society. And we also talked in the second part of our workshop how schools act to replicate society. But let's start with looking at in what ways schools are replicas of society. In our workshop, we did a little quiz where we looked at where we were born, where our parents were born, how many of us might have had ancestors from Australia going back thousands of years. We looked at where we grew up. Did we grow up in the country, or did we grow up in the city, or somewhere that's rural and remote? We looked at where we went to school. We looked at our religions. We looked at how connected we were to each other through technology. We also looked at our levels of ability and disability. And we looked at how classy we were, whether we saw ourselves as coming from a privileged background or a disadvantaged background or somewhere in the middle. And not surprisingly, the sorts of figures that we came out with were fairly reflective of general society, with the exception of how well educated we were. We're a fairly elite group here at a postgraduate level of university. So that was something that was a little different. So what I was getting at with that quiz was that it points to the diversity that we have in our own class, and it's a diversity that's reflected in the majority of classrooms you will teach in. Differences that result from our gender, from culture, from religion, from ethnicity, from socioeconomic background, from our level of ability, from our sexuality. All of these differences play out in our classroom. And we looked at a couple of quotes, and I wanted you to think a little bit about what that is saying to you. I also asked you to have a look at this little quote. Schools are places that reflect the makeup of Australian society in all its wonderful diversity. But schools also reflect current societal thinking about diversity. And whilst most schools would claim to be open and embracing of diversity and difference, some schools and some teachers do diversity and difference better than others. In Bell Hooks's quote, she talks about fear, and we choose safety instead of risk, and importantly, sameness instead of diversity. Schools are places that tend towards a normalisation. The square pegs are forced to fit in to the round holes, often because people think it's easier that way. But our students in schools reflect the diversity in society, and as Bell Hooks says, something to be embraced, acknowledged and accepted. I wanted to link back to our topic from last week of teacher talk. As teachers, how we talk, and remembered I interpreted talk quite broadly. Our language, our gestures, our lessons, the choice of resources we use, how we physically arrange our class and so on. So what does talk have to do with diversity and difference? It has a lot, as we touched on last week. How we talk tells our students and our school community a lot about what we think and what we believe. And our talk can reveal a lot about these beliefs. Let's have a look at stereotypes and labelling. What is a stereotype? Well, we all generalise in order to make sense of the world around us. We look for patterns in what we observe, including patterns in people and in their behaviours. But we easily move into overgeneralising, and we oversimplify a concept or an image of a person. And that leads to stereotypes. And they're incomplete and inaccurate beliefs that some people hold about groups of other people. Think about some of these statements. Everyone in America drives big cars. It's always raining and cold in Melbourne. Not this weekend, it wasn't. Women aren't as smart as men. All Irish people are drunks and eat potatoes. All teenage boys are messy and smelly. All blondes are unintelligent. Goths wear black clothes, black makeup, are depressed and hated by society. All Asians are good at maths. If we think about any of these statements rationally, we know them to be untrue. They are gross generalisations and oversimplifications. They generalise a few well-publicised characteristics onto an entire population, and importantly, they ignore the individual. So surely we know the difference between a stereotype and the individual. We might, but stereotypes and the labels that go with them can have far-reaching impacts. I showed a couple of YouTube videos. The links to them are on the PowerPoint, which is available on the website. We looked at a cute little video for a superannuation company that showed little boys wanting to grow up to be policemen, little girls growing up to be ballet teachers. And then we looked at Alex Dang's YouTube performance of What Kind of an Asian Am I? Have a look at those videos and have a little think about what stereotypes are being played out in the advertisements and what might be the impact of those stereotypes. It's essential to pay attention to how you talk as it acts to include or exclude. How you talk normalises some students but positions some students as somehow other, as different, as being out rather than being in. Othering may not be conscious discrimination, but it does mean that some voices are silenced. They are out, not in. I talked about an example of a fourth year student that I was visiting on his final placement, and he was conducting a reading group, a guided reading group with about 4 or 5 of his students. And the book, in guided reading, all the children are reading exactly the same book from a set that the classroom teacher has. And in this particular activity, the book that he'd chosen was about bugs. His opening statement, his talk to these boys and girls was, "We've got a book about bugs. Now, I'm sure the boys are going to really like this, maybe the girls not so much." And there was a utter disbelief on my part. But it's those little assumptions and those unassuming and perhaps thoughtless comments that we make that can act to reinforce stereotypes and labels and to continue to silence some voices. The little girls in that reading group were not going to say, "But I like bugs." Interesting. In our language, our discourse, we tend to normalise dominant social practices and ways of being and position as other, different ways of being. The literature, for example, argues that educational settings are heteronormative. That is, they assume that all members of their communities are heterosexual. When was the last time you read a book aimed at a primary school child that depicted same-sex parents? What might be the impact of this assumption on those who are not heterosexual? What impact might this way of being in a school, this heteronormativity, have on newly arrived teachers or even pre-service teachers to a staff room who identify as LGBTI, or to students in the classroom? What impact might calling something gay as a derogatory term have on those who identify as gay? Does silence about the use of this term condone the behaviour of the oppressor? What other assumptions do educational settings make about families, for example, or about religion, or about ability? What mechanisms do you use when you're on placement in these settings to unpack the assumptions, to identify what behaviours, what attributes are being normalised? We talked about the different levels of action that might be required for an educational setting to adopt a more inclusive stance. Putting in place appropriate policies and structures at an organisational level is critical. So, for example, in the case of a student with or a staff member with a physical disability, we're not just talking about the obvious wheelchair ramps, but within the classroom, how are tables laid out appropriately for someone in a wheelchair or using braces? How do classroom structures accommodate for difference? Does multi-ageing help or hinder? What policies or supports are in place for students with differing needs? So last week we talked a little bit about some policies that help students feel as though they belong. How's the community involved in decision making and program implementation within the school? At the individual level, reflect on your own beliefs and practices. Once again, we ask you to reflect. In what ways might you inadvertently be acting or talking to exclude some of your students? How might you be acting, or what language might you be using that perpetuates the stereotypes? Get to know your students, then do some research on their dimension of difference. If they're from a religion or cultural group you know little about, then find out. Engage with their parents to discover more. Acknowledge difference, but also identify and acknowledge similarities. At an instructional level, don't avoid questions about difference. Actively educate your students about diversity, difference, and acceptance. And your choice of resources, the books that you use, the videos that you might show, should validate that difference. In the breakout session, students talked about specific strategies, breaking these general statements of mine down into specific things that they experienced or saw, and were considering what other sorts of approaches they might take. Last week, and in the first part of this week's workshop, I focused very strongly on teacher talk. Partly that's in preparation for your own placement experience coming up, that you need to be paying attention to your own talk. I also asked you last week to read an article, a Guardian article by Ian Leslie, that suggests that aspects of teacher talk, the teach like a champion strategies and techniques that he referred to quite extensively, can transform a classroom. So the implication in some parts of that article was that by adopting these snazzy, latest, greatest techniques and strategies, a teacher has superpowers. They can transform what's going on in the classroom just by the bag of tricks that they carry with them. I'd like to problematise the notion that is implicit in that article, and it's being perpetuated by people like John Hattie and others who put forward the idea that teacher quality is the single biggest factor in the learning success of young people in schools. I don't want to dismiss it out of hand, but I want you to unpack it a little and think a little bit critically about these sort of arguments. Teacher quality is important. It's really important. Otherwise, we wouldn't have teacher education institutions and I'd be out of a job. But do teachers have superpowers? Can they overcome some of the cultural and societal factors that affect students' schooling, that they bring with them from beyond the school gate? For some answers to this question, to help us problematise this issue, we would be well advised to look to Pierre Bourdieu and his theory of cultural and social capital and habitus. So that's where we're heading. I showed a very brief 2-minute video that encapsulates fairly quickly some of the key constructs of Bourdieu's theory. And I urge you to have a quick look, maybe a couple of looks at that particular video. But I wanted to focus on 2 elements of his theory in particular, that of habitus and of the different sorts of capital, particularly cultural capital. Habitus is a kind of slippery little concept, but Bourdieu really talked about it in the sense that we operate in different fields, different aspects of our life. So, for example, we operate at school, we operate at home and with our family. I operate in a work environment. I also belong to a club. So in all of these fields, there are different ways of behaving, different codes of behaviour. And habitus is that feel for the game, as Bourdieu put it. He used a quite strongly sporting analogy, knowing how to respond and navigate in that specific social environment. And he talks about it as having the resources at your fingertips almost. It becomes an automatic thing, not something that you have to deliberately think about. Having the resources or different types of capital that give you this feel for the game. And that capital could be economic capital, which is financial resources. It could be social capital, the networks that you come from, the people that you know, or it could be cultural capital. So the cultural capital are those beliefs, those norms, those attitudes, the experiences that equip you for your life in any particular field in your society. That cultural capital could be something that's embodied. It could be the accent with which you speak. And that can help you or hinder you. That capital could be objectified. It could be something that you wear, for example, that tells people where you fit, where you belong. So we talked about the sorts of clothes that currently and in the past have helped you feel like you belong. For me, as a teenager at school, it was having Adidas Roams, Levi 501s, or Amco jeans, flares, and a Miller shirt or a Golden Breed wind cheater. Now you'll know how old I really am. Today it could be camel-coloured skinnies and a Ned Kelly beard that signifies you're a little bit indie or hip. That cultural capital could be institutionalised. It could be a degree or a qualification. Those things that give us a sense of belonging with other like-minded people, a collective identity of people who are like us. But cultural capital can also be a sense of inequity. Certain forms of cultural capital are valued over others, and not having these can hinder your social mobility as much as wealth can. I have a friend, I didn't actually tell this in the lecture, I had a friend when I was at university. He came from the country and he wore nothing but stubbies, and I mean nothing but stubbies. For those of you who are not old enough to know what a stubby is, it's not the thing that you drink your beer out of. It was a pair of shorts, working man's shorts that the builders wore and the tradies wore and the farmers also wore. My friend was a member of the MCG and rocked up one day to go to the cricket to sit in the members' stand, but was rejected because he had stubbies on. His disclaimer was, "But they're my best stubbies." However, the point was, stubbies were not part of the cultural capital that you needed to get entrance into the members' stand, even though you were a paid-up member. So we talked also about how we acquire that cultural capital. And we acquire it from our experiences, from our families and our friends. And when you don't have family or friends that have the experiences necessary to help you acquire the cultural capital to operate successfully within a particular field, for example, within school, that places you at a distinct disadvantage. And Bourdieu's argument goes that families or children from young people from families who haven't had the experiences of schooling as we know it are at a disadvantage. How does a child who's never sat on their parents' lap and had a book read to them manage to cope with reading? What are the implications of a young person whose family doesn't value the importance of education and doesn't mind if you don't go to school for 4 days out of every 5? Where's the knowledge that those young people... Young people who are socialised in the dominant culture have an advantage over those who are not, since schools tend to be places that reproduce or replicate the dominant cultural values and ideals and practices. Over time, we tend to fit in, to adopt the practices of the dominant culture so that we belong. We become socialised. And it's in this way those who succeed at school are reproducing the dominant culture. So again, what happens if you lack the cultural capital and habitus to fit in with the dominant culture in a school? If you choose different, to perhaps adopt a countercultural stance, if you embody difference, your race, your religion, your sexuality, what happens when a young person doesn't fit in with the dominant culture in a school? Are they excluded socially? Are they at a disadvantage educationally? Are they judged by their teachers? The argument goes that the majority of at-risk children tend to come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, where there is less cultural capital, where there are fewer resources to draw upon to support young people's educational journey. They are less able to negotiate the system. Families are less able to support their young people in doing their homework. They place less value on education. Again, a generalisation, so be careful of that. Higher rates of non-attendance, fewer resources. Let's draw on a particular analogy. 3 people walk into a bakery, an Australian, a Malaysian and an Indonesian. The Australian knows exactly what's in those mystery parcels that we call pies, hands over the money, grabs a little sachet of sauce as well, cracks a joke with the person serving in the bakery and walks out. All good. The Malaysian learnt a little bit of English at school because English was a compulsory subject. But he's not familiar with the array of pies and sausage rolls on display. But with some gesturing, a few words here and there, some smiles, he eventually gets what he wants. It takes a little bit longer, but in the end, it works out okay. The Indonesian, on the other hand, knows no English, and like the Malaysian, has no idea what's in the pies and sausage rolls. They're completely alien type of food to him. After much pointing and shouting, the Australian baker tends to speak very loudly and slowly when he's not sure he's being understood. The Indonesian is none the wiser. Eventually orders a pie out of sheer starvation, only to find out as he walks out the door that it contains meat, and he doesn't know if that meat is halal meat or not, so he ends up having to throw it away. Can anyone see a parallel to the classroom? The Australian in the classroom would be considered the bright child, the parents who are well qualified, who might have grown up being read to every night, has music and drama lessons after school, plays regular sport in a team, always has a book on the go. The Malaysian might be the average child who gets some things but struggles with other things, whose dad might run his own small business while mum keeps the books. Muddles through, gets there in the end, but takes a bit longer than the bright kids do. The Indonesian might be analogous to the child of refugees who might be struggling with English language, with the customs that are at school, especially when they are so different from those at home. A child who may never actually have been to school, either in refugee camps or back in their homeland. It might be a child who has special needs that aren't being met. The child with dyslexia who can't keep up because the symbols on the board make little sense, and so on. Okay, just moving slightly away from Bourdieu now and his theory about social reproduction and how that plays out, particularly in education. I wanted to share with you this little Ginger Meg's comic strip and alert you to an article, another Guardian article. You should all subscribe to the Guardian's education section. Some wonderful ideas are raised in that publication. I taught Stripe how to whistle. I don't hear him whistling. I said I taught him. I didn't say I learned it. Ultimately, children do the learning. We teach. Teaching doesn't automatically equate to learning. We can't force anybody to learn. Some children learn more easily than others. Some learn at different paces to others for whatever reason. And that might be a cultural reason linking back to Bourdieu. They might resist learning. They're not machines. They're people, individuals. Even some of the best teachers, like Chris Wheat, whose article you read this week, who is an outstanding teacher, has lots of tricks, cannot overcome some of the issues his students bring with them to the classroom, despite all those tricks. The following words are taken from this article that I linked to on this slide. The quality of an education system cannot exceed the quality of teachers. And this is the teacher myth. It's often presented as a simple equation. Great teaching gets great results. It's a view that's widely held because it's tremendously appealing. It's easy. We just fix the teachers and improve the teachers and everything will get better. But it ignores the heart of the societal issues that are played out and replicated in schools. Teacher quality is important. It really is. But it's not the only factor that's at play. And being a good teacher is much more than having a bag of snazzy teacher tricks.